The New York Knicks stole both games in San Antonio and are now just 2 wins away from being NBA champions for the first time in 53 years. Their playoff run has been genuinely unbelievable. And I say this as someone who watches the NBA closely and paid very much close attention to the Knicks in the regular season and especially early in their playoff run because I covered the Atlanta Hawks. I didn't have a choice. I had to pay attention to what they were building. And what they've got going right now is unbelievable. I can't even put it into words how dominant they've been. They have not lost since the series against the Atlanta Hawks. The last time they lost was actually in game 3 to the Atlanta Hawks, to where they trailed 2-1 in the series. And they have not lost since then. And now they are up 2-0 in the finals, going back to Madison Square Garden. And it's, of course, going to be an unbelievable atmosphere. And then you look at the players that have contributed to their postseason run and gotten them to this point. Of course, it's the usual contributors. Jalen Brunson, despite his inconsistencies and a lot of the inefficiency he's shown in the NBA Finals, specifically in just 2 games, his impact has been great, as it always is. He's still able to get a bucket when they need him to. With the game on the line, he was still the one taking the shots. And even though, again, he was inconsistent, you want your star taking shots. Volume is what matters more than consistency in the postseason, and that has been on full display with his playoff run with the Knicks. Karl-Anthony Towns has been incredible, and there's no other way around it. Cat is playing the best basketball of his life. As soon as they made that Game 3 adjustment against the Atlanta Hawks, they've been running their offense a lot more through Cat, and he's been looking the best he's ever looked in his career. He's playmaking out of the post, he's backing down defenders, and he's facilitating offense. He is knocking down the 3 ball with consistency, as he's always been able to do in his career. Cat's impact has been all the way up there with some of the best players in the NBA in terms of their recent postseason runs. But the player who stuck out the most to me in watching the Knicks all playoffs, the whole postseason, just having to watch the Knicks, as someone who, again, supports the Atlanta Hawks and also covers the Atlanta Hawks, watching the way the Knicks play, I don't think there's been any more impactful player than OG Anunoby. There are many ways to describe Anunoby's game and his impact on and off the floor, but the way I like to describe him is a run stopper. Anytime games not necessarily start to get away from the Knicks, but as soon as the momentum starts to go in the other direction, Anunoby's always the one to be like, all right, calm down. We're still in control. We still are in control of our own destiny. His timely shot making all postseason long has been monumental. Again, taking it back to the Atlanta Hawks series, that whole series, Anunoby was so dominant. And he averaged over 20 points a game. He was averaging over 21 points a game. He was shooting over 60% from the field, over 50% from deep. I mean, just incredible numbers all around. I think like 8 rebounds a game, something ridiculous. And it didn't really come as much of a surprise if you watched that series, because he was the guy who was really making a statement that the Knicks were the better team than the Hawks and were probably the best team in the Eastern Conference. And, after that series and after what he was able to display, it should have, left no doubt in anyone's heads that they were going to win the Eastern Conference and probably win the NBA championship. Many people also forget that in Game 6 against the Atlanta Hawks, the one that, the Knicks won in historic fashion, they got up by like 60 points. They didn't win exactly by 60, but the lead was up there for most of the game. Just completely got out of hand in like late in the first quarter, and it never really shifted. The momentum didn't at all. People often forget that in that game, the Hawks actually got off to a pretty decent start. The Atlanta crowd was behind them. Nickeil Alexander-Walker hit a corner 3, and the Knicks had to call a timeout. The Hawks actually, I believe, went on a 9-0 run, 9-0 spurt in that first quarter, and they had a decent lead. But yeah, Mike Brown called a timeout, and then from that timeout on, it was never really a doubt. And right out of that timeout, and really just in terms of controlling the momentum, taking the momentum back to where they needed it to be, OG started knocking down tough threes. They weren't just regular threes that he was getting in the flow of the Knicks offense, but he was just pulling with confidence, probably usually 2 hands in his face, just pulling like no one's in front of him. And he has a high arcing shot, and they were going in every single time. As I said, I covered the Hawks. I was there. I was watching it live. And again, I was rooting for the Hawks, but I couldn't help but just take a step back and notice what was happening in front of me. With them shooting like this and with Anunoby specifically having this impact, no one was going to stop them. And that has proven to be true, all the way into this postseason where now we're in the NBA Finals and they're 2 wins away from their first NBA championship in 53 years. To say his impact has translated through the rest of the postseason would be a complete understatement. He's been unbelievable. He's still averaging almost 20 points a game for the entire postseason. If Karl Anthony Towns wasn't going as crazy as he was right now, he'd probably, be a front runner for Finals MVP, just considering all he's been able to accomplish. And this comes with a little extra motivation for Anunoby. If you look at his history and you look at exactly what fueled this run, it's hard to not root for him. And this is why we've dedicated a piece towards him instead of, any other Knicks player that would be well deserving, of a segment. Anunoby's story is inspiring, and what happened early in his NBA career definitely is the reason why he's able to play this well on this big stage, and just have an absolute impact that cannot be replicated. So, if you guys have forgotten a little bit, because it's hard to, remember, just a few years back in NBA history, just considering all that's happened since then. But in 2019, the Toronto Raptors won the NBA title. They were NBA champions. It was one of the best playoff runs we've ever seen. The whole city of Toronto was hyped. It was a great time just to be watching. Kawhi Leonard was going crazy. He got that ring in his 1 year as a Toronto Raptor and then went to the Clippers the year after. But in that run, and you look at who was on the roster, OG Anunoby was on the roster. He was in his second NBA season. He was coming off of a rookie season where he didn't get a whole lot of action. His playing time gradually increased in his second year. He averaged like 7 points a game that year. Was just a solid role player off the bench. He was filling a role pretty much. He was just locked into that role player, title. But right before the postseason, he had to undergo a procedure that ended up having him miss the entire postseason. Even though his team won the championship, and even though on his basketball reference page he has a title, in his accolades he is already an NBA champion, but even with that, he did not get to play a second of postseason basketball during that run. He didn't get to win the finals. He was on that team, and the impact that he displayed in the regular season, and on even like in the locker room, and also like just being with the team during that finals run, like yes, his impact was still there, but not getting to contribute on one of the best runs in NBA history. That's not something you just forget. That's not something you just put in your back pocket and you keep walking. Anunoby used this as motivation. This has fueled him to become the player he is today. And as I said, it's hard to not root for a guy with that much motivation, that much, kind of chip on his shoulder. Players are at their best when they have a chip on their shoulder. And Anunoby absolutely has had a chip on his shoulder this whole postseason run. And again, it's resulted in the best basketball of his career and a run that he's never going to forget. The evolution of Anunoby's game is just kind of a valuable lesson that everyone that watches the NBA could learn. Everything happens for a reason. Could you have imagined, and let me just get this straight. Being an NBA champion, regardless of how it happens, is a great accomplishment. And again, it's an accolade that OG has that he's never just going to take lightly. He was in his second NBA season and he won a ring. But again, that motivation that comes with not being able to contribute on the court to that run, it just added an extra element of edge to his personality, his game. And the thing about Anunoby is that throughout his career, he's been in a variety of roles. Again, as in his second year, he was just a role player that came off the bench. He gradually progressed into a starter in Toronto. He eventually got traded to the New York Knicks in a package that sent RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickley to the Toronto Raptors. This ultimately ended up being a great move, honestly, for both franchises. Because Toronto just had a very underrated season. They had their best season in some time, and the Knicks are, 2 games away from an NBA title. I think this can probably be a win-win trade, although I would argue that the Knicks probably won it. Given the current circumstances, that certainly makes sense. But yeah, as I said earlier, it's hard to not root for Anunoby, and everything happens for a reason. He was put in that position in his second NBA season just so he could blossom. He could come back to the playoffs brighter. And since then, since that moment, even in prior postseasons, ones that he didn't make it all the way to the NBA title, he has still had the impact that we know he can have. He has not let that go down. He's been in 6 postseasons in his NBA career, and in 4 of them, he shot over 40% from deep. This is a guy who's operating with real efficiency, and now he's doing it at the best he's done in his career on the biggest stage of his career. And all you can think of as an average NBA watcher is just big congrats to OG Anunoby, because this is a redemption story that should not be ignored. And I wish and I hope he would get more national coverage, but he's not someone who has the electric personality that NBA media loves to cover. He's not someone who's gonna go with the antics and have to do all of these other things to make a name for himself. He's putting his head down, he's playing basketball, he's being humble, and he's doing it better than probably anyone in the league right now. So congrats, OG, and it's been fun watching you and his playoff series just in general, and regardless of any sort of resentment that Hawks fans have towards the New York Knicks, again, it's hard to not root for a guy like OG. So see you guys next time.